just trying to wonder how far back it quit, so if people are going to miss a lot of information. But probably. We're back now? Okay. So oh, way back. Okay, okay. That's a good 5 minutes. Okay. Uh, Great, I have to hear myself now. Okay. Okay, way back. Okay. Okay, I've got to restart everything. Exactly. Just give me a thumbs up when we're good to go. Mr. Ving, this is adding time to my grade 12 project, correct? No. No. Got it? Okay. Mic's working and everything? Mic check? Cool. Awesome. Cool, great. Sorry for the interruption there. A couple technical difficulties. I'll go back a couple slides here and start where I left off. So like I was saying, after the Korean War in around 1959 was one of the most influential and effective firearms created in our modern day. The AR-15, invented by Eugene Stoner, produced by Armalite, like I said, is one of the most perceived rifles in modern day and is used for sport shooting, self-defense, hunting, and military use by both countries. As well, in our modern day, the US and Canada still import a number of foreign weapons into the countries, if they're legal. Another key attribute that we can see between the difference in firearms culture between North America is the rules in which people are able to obtain firearms. Starting with the US, one of the key differences is that firearms regulations and laws are regulated by the state. This means each state senators and state decides firearms for the specific state. Large differences can be seen between states such as California and Texas, where in states like California they impose rifle restrictions, magazine capacity restrictions, and waiting times before people can buy firearms. On the other side of things, we can see states such as Texas, where all you need is a piece of ID, quick background check, and you're able to buy a firearm. And one is also able to open carry and conceal carry without a permit or with a permit, depending on what state you're in. Like I said, most firearms are legal most firearms are legal to civilians to buy, except for fully automatic firearms, known as machine guns, made after 1986. Although it's not impossible to acquire these firearms, and are usually acquired by businesses. What a business first needs to do, or an individual running a business, is they first need to get what's known as an FFL, a Federal Firearms License, which only businesses can obtain. Next, the individual needs to consider what kind of business they want to run. Most businesses usually own these types of firearms are importers, or people who import and export firearms, manufacturers, or people who run shooting ranges. Third step is they need to pay a tax called the special occupational tax. This is why these people are usually known as SOT dealers. Those are usually people who manufacture firearms. And they need to do numerous pieces of paperwork. The final step they need to do is they need to take a course. Looking at the other side of things, in Canada, one of the key differences we can see is that we regulate our laws on a federal level. This means the government decides rules and regulations, and those regulations are imposed in the whole country, and everyone has to follow the same rules. The first steps into acquiring a firearm in Canada is what's known as getting your possession and acquisition license. This is a 10-hour course dedicated to the safe handling, history, and operation of non-restricted firearms, which is the first class of firearms you're able to buy with a possession and acquisition license. Moving on from there are 3 classes of firearms in Canada. The first class of firearms is known as the non-restricted class. As you can see here, the non-restricted firearms usually consist of manually operated firearms such as bolt-action rifles, shotguns, lever actions, and other repeating rifles. Some exceptions to this are a few semi-automatic rifles such as older models or older firearms that have been decided by the government. The second class of firearms is what's known as restricted. These firearms consist of handguns that are not prohibited, and you need another special kind of license to acquire these firearms. This is called the Restricted Possession and Acquisition License. This is another 10-hour course you must take, which is also dedicated to the safe handling, history, and operation of restricted firearms. Third classification of firearms is known as prohibited. These classes of firearms usually consist of military-grade weapons, such as the newly introduced AR-15, any sort of AK style weapon, or any other military weapons used by militaries around the world, and fully automatic firearms. Although there is an exception to owning these firearms, and that is if they were registered before 1998. You can't use them, they must be deactivated, but you are allowed to put them on display as long as they're unable to be fired. One of the next key differences between the US and Canada in terms of our rules and regulations is the difference in storage. In Canada, firearms must be stored in a separate locked cabinet from their ammunition, and they must not be easily accessible. While this can be very different in the United States, like I said, depending on which state you're in, some firearms do not impose safe storage firearms regulations, and people can place firearms wherever they want in their house, and they can be easily accessible. One of the next things I'd like to talk about when noticing the difference in firearms culture between the US and Canada is how people in each society view firearms. I'm going to tell you a little bit about 2 firearms rights advocacy groups in both nations. Starting with the US, one of the leading gun advocacy groups is known as the NRA, or the National Rifle Association, which was established in 1871. A quote by them states, "Widely recognized today as a major political force and as America's foremost defender of a Second Amendment rights, the NRA, since its inception, has been the premier firearms education organization in the world." Some of their lead goals is to promote rifle shooting, firearms science, conservation, and they are a huge voice for Second Amendment rights throughout the US. They offer an abundance of different courses, including technical courses, safety courses, as well as military training. And they do this with over 13,000 instructors. Moving over to Canada, one of the leading gun advocacy groups in Canada is known as the CCFR, or the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights. Quote by them here is, "The Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights aims to be a strong and reputable public-facing voice for Canadian firearms owners. We are committed to maintaining our current rights and freedoms while continuing to push as a mobilizing and organizational force for positive legislative change." The CCFR is a volunteer organization, and they are committed to sharing information and statistics through TV shows, podcasts, and other social media platforms, as well, sort of similar to the NRA, as being a voice for firearms advocacy rights. They do this through a couple different types of shows. One of their main ones is known as the Canada Downrange series, which airs on Wild TV, and that goes around to different communities showing off the different events that that firearms owners in Canada and different ranges can put on, just showcasing the firearms community in Canada. One of the main causes we can see of the difference, though, is when it comes to the citizens. In an interview I did with Rod Giltaca, who is the executive director of the CCFR, he explained that there's two different kinds of demographics of people regarding firearms. There are people with lots of firearms experience who just see firearms as another machine that could be potentially dangerous. And there are people with no to limited experience who either choose to ignore the topic or don't know much about it at all. Through this, we can see that firearms can become a very political topic with lots of experiences that people have experienced throughout firearms, whether they be good or bad. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation surrounding the firearms community from biased sources and other forms. These ideals of firearms, of politics surrounding firearms can be seen radically in both countries with a lot of different types of things such as militias. Moving on to my final topic, that is acknowledging our constitutional rights towards firearms and the difference in our rights between both countries. Starting with the US, was one of the key factors of firearms in the US was with the Constitution written in 1787. Following the writing of the Constitution was the Second Amendment in 1791, and this states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is a powerful statement that hasn't been changed since the last more than 200 years since it had been written. And its basic purpose was to defend the firearms rights of the people to be able to fight against a tyrannical government. This was mainly because of the American Revolution having to overthrow the British occupation. This statement has been the backbone of a lot of gun advocacy groups in the US and reinforces multiple of the groups' ability to combat legislative change. Moving on forward, we can see that most states, depending on what state you're in, have what are known as stand your ground laws or no duty to retreat laws. These are based off the Castle Doctrine. These laws allow individuals the means necessary to defend yourself if you feel your life or property is in danger. As long as you can, if there's an incident involving a firearm, as long as you can prove it was because of self-defense, you will not be charged. Moving over to Canada, Canada does not have the same constitutional right as the United States. This is mainly because Canada never had to go through the same revolutionary status as the United States did. In a quote in 1993 by Justice Peter Corey, he states, "Canadians, unlike Americans, do not have a constitutional right to bear arms." This can be further seen in 2005 by Justice Louis Sharon saying, "Possession and use of firearms is not a right or freedom guaranteed under the Charter, but a privilege." Although this doesn't mean that people still can't fight for their privileges, as seen with a lot of different groups as seen by a lot of different firearms advocacy groups. Moving forward to another topic, Canada does not have the same stand your ground laws or Castle Doctrine as the US. This makes things complicated in terms of using firearms for self-defense and the right to bear arms, as there's a lot of gray area in terms of when to use a firearm. This also means that cases where firearms were used for self-defense are always for the judge to decide. Like I said, there's a lot of gray area surrounding this, such as who was the attacker, what were the circumstances, did you have a chance to retreat, are just a limited amount of factors that can come into effect when deciding if a firearm is used for personal defense. In conclusion, firearms are a large and huge part of North American society, and the difference in firearm culture can be seen through the history, the legislation, how they're viewed by society, and the constitutional side behind them. I want to end you guys with just a little thing on how you can get involved if you're interested in learning more about the firearms community. One thing you can do is take the course, the possession and acquisition course, get a little bit of a knowledge around how firearms work, safety behind them, and a little bit about our history. Another way I suggest is maybe finding someone who owns firearms and going to arrange with them, getting some experience behind. Because personally, in my experience, I've found that the firearms community is very generous, open to accepting new people. Thank you very much for listening. Now I'd like to introduce to you my artistic. The medium I decided to use for my artistic is made out of once fired centerfire brass. And this, in my opinion, shows a lot of the generosity of the firearms community, as shells today are pretty expensive and not that easy to come by. A lot of these I had donated to me by multiple members from the PWA shooting range, which I thought was very kind of all of them to do. The reason I chose these two symbols was to show some of the difference behind the constitutional side behind firearms. the shield representing the United States and putting the protection into this individual using firearms, and a government-style building representing Canada and the reliance on government that I've seen and heard from a lot of different Canadian citizens. A couple challenges I had with creating this, definitely finding all the brass, because if I didn't find it all, I'd be spending probably over $600, which is a lot of money. Also, another challenge was it was very tough to keep them in there. I had a couple times where they all fell out, which was pretty demoralizing, but in the end, got finished. I'll now open the floor to any questions you guys may have. Well, I believe mostly in Canada it's 18. 18 is the regular age where you're able to take the possession and acquisition license course. And in the US, I believe it is also 18 when you can go and buy a firearm. Are there any other questions?
James, yes, a second question. In his book, Why We Act Like Canadians,
Just talk loud.
a second question, James. Audio on the mic. Check, check. Thanks, James. Amazing presentation, by the way. A second question for you. In his book, Why We Act Like Canadians, Pierre Burton suggests a connection between Canada's loyalty to the King Queen and our less permissive attitude towards guns. Do you see that connection, and do you think that it suggests more trust amongst Canadians to their government?
Well, I do, in a fact, sort of see that. I'm just trying to answer this question as best as I can. I do believe since, like I was suggesting, Canada never had to go through the same thing as the US due to a revolution, and we sort of, in a way, sort of submitted to the British, and that, in fact, puts a lot of our trust in the government. And sort of relating to that question, like I said, back towards how we have a privilege to own firearms, we're sort of entrusting our privilege into the government. And in my opinion, I feel like the government might always not make the right choices compared to the civilian population. And, I'm just trying to answer this question. I feel like firearms owners have a lot to lose in terms of legislation. And what I've seen personally is, and what I've read is that firearms owners in Canada are some of the most lawful citizens, because like we know that it's a privilege that we have, and we know what we have to lose if we end up breaking the law. If that answered your question, any other questions?
James, have you taken any safety courses yourself? And could you kind of give us an overview of what your personal experience was with those courses?
Well, yes, I have, in fact, taken the possession and acquisition license course involving law of safety. And in my opinion, I took it at the Spud Valley hunting store in Pemberton, and I thought it was a very great experience. They were very safe around it. It was very knowledgeable. I think I took it with around 10, 12 other people. And in my experience, they teach you really well. Mostly everyone who even goes there usually passes, if you have great instructors. There's two aspects of actually acquiring it at the end. You have to do two tests. There's a practical test and a written test. Practical test is where they run you through a number of different scenarios involving firearms. And the written component is, it's a written test that you have to do with multiple yes or no questions, multiple choice questions. If that answers the question. Are we all done for questions?
Do you have a firearm and do you use it?
I personally do not have a firearm because I am not old enough to own one. I'm only 17, but our family does own firearms, and we do go to the range. I wouldn't say very often, but once in a while we'll go to the range. Personally, in my opinion, it's a great way to just get me outside. It's a fun family activity that we do. Just go to the range, spend a couple hours. It's one of those sports where you can really see yourself improve. Personally, especially over time as you do it, and there's so much leniency and stuff you can do within, the hobby of firearms, and I really enjoy doing it because something that's so in-depth, and you can go as in-depth or as little in-depth as you want and do so much with it. So, yeah.
Canada's government recently enlisted a buyback program for restricted rifles, I believe. What is your opinion on that?
Well, what I've heard, I don't think they've actually really bought back any firearms yet. And I mean, in my personal opinion, I can see behind it why they would do it, but it's going to cost a lot of money to do it in general. And I mean, if each firearm that they're buying back, which was mainly AR-15s, which were banned, were usually around, if you buy them from Canada, probably around $800 to $1,000. Apparently there's over 2 million of them in Canada. That's a lot of money to buy all those firearms back. So, I mean, I can see the reasoning behind it from the government, but in my opinion, it's just going to cost a lot of taxpayers' money, in my opinion, for something that might not have been justified. In my opinion. Cool. I would now like to hand over the floor to Kai Nielsen, who's going to be talking about, sorry? Oh, yeah, oops. I would now like to hand the floor over to Kai Nielsen, who will be talking about social hierarchies.
Recently, I conducted a study at the Whistler Waldorf High School on social dominance. In this study, I asked participants to choose an individual, both from their class and from the whole school, who they deemed the most influential, and why. During this study, I received a lot of comments from participants who told me that they had never thought about the types of questions I was asking them. This came as a surprise to me, because social hierarchies, no matter what you call them, define the makeup of our societies and affect us both as a people and as individuals. My name is Kai Nielsen, and I've spent the last year studying social hierarchies. I've always been interested in psychology and the brain. I find understanding why people do what they do fascinating. So I knew I wanted my grade 12 project to be about psychology, and especially the chemical side to our brains. The social hierarchies topic fit both of my criteria. I first heard about social hierarchies last summer when listening to a podcast with my mom called 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. In his book, Jordan Peterson talks about lobster hierarchies and compares them to our own. I was hooked. As defined here, social hierarchies are a set of social norms or rules that constrain the behavior of individuals depending on their rank. Essentially, they are the way in which a society organizes its members into certain positions based on various factors. Human beings are incredibly social. Even if you are a quieter, more introverted person, you still need social interaction. We also love organization. Throughout history, our species has consistently been the most comfortable when everything around us is categorized and organized. The same goes for us ourselves. Now, social hierarchies are both social and organizational structures, which has made them be a strong and consistent part of our species for as far back as we know. Before I continue, there are a couple terms that need to be better defined in order to understand these social structures. The first of which is dominance. Dominance refers to an individual who holds power or authority over others, and oftentimes acts in aggressive ways. Individuals who receive these acts of aggression are referred to as subordinates. Now, I recognize that dominance is a loaded term, but it isn't always bad. Throughout history, there are many examples of dominant members who have either abused their power, like Louis XVI of France, or actually used it to benefit the common good, a leader like Nelson Mandela. Social hierarchies have a very, very long history in both human and animal societies. They have been intertwined with our species since the beginning of time. As humans, we have an incredible ability to recognize social structures from the beginning of our lives. I'm sure we've all spent time with babies. Now for me, the reason why babies are so engaging is because they are fascinated with our faces. This is kind of surprising because at this point in life, children can't even see our faces clearly. To newborns, we just look like blurs of color. However, they still consistently choose to look at human faces instead of other similar objects. As children grow, their understanding of the social world grows with them. By the time that a child is 3, they are able to recognize their peers who are superior and know that holding a dominant position in society is desirable. To better understand our own social structures, I'm first going to talk about animals because they follow very similar social hierarchies. Jordan Peterson talked a lot about lobsters in his book and compared them to ours. Now, when you first look at a lobster, it seems very different to us. I don't have big pinchers or a hard shell. However, we will find that lobsters act very similarly to human beings when competing for social status. The reason why I'm talking about lobsters specifically is because they have a very similar neurochemical brain to our own. However, it's just simpler, so it makes them easier to study. Now, lobsters are very territorial beings. They are constantly getting into fights over resources, territory, and mates. Their response to either wins or losses in the social realm is monitored by 2 hormones, the first of which is serotonin, and the second, octopamine. Human beings also possess serotonin. It's a feel-good drug. I get rushes of serotonin when whizzing down a groomer on a bluebird day or watching a beautiful sunset. It is for this reason that serotonin is a common drug prescribed to people struggling with depression because it is meant to bring about a rush of happiness and productivity. Now, in lobsters, high serotonin levels are commonly found in a lobster who's just won a fight. This results in a very confident lobster who can even get a little bit cocky. Now, in my experience, cockiness doesn't tend to work out for people. However, it does for lobsters, as these lobsters actually change their body posture to reflect a more intimidating and courageous creature. This lobster then is able to work its way up the hierarchy chain. Now, in this situation, there must also be a loser. However, sometimes it's hard to spot the loser because they oftentimes clear the area as quickly as possible. Octopamine is responsible for this disappearance. Octopamine is found in high concentrations in lobsters who just lost a battle, and it's basically the opposite of serotonin. It results in a scrunched up, sad-looking creature. It can oftentimes take these lobsters days to regain their composure, and sometimes they are never the same as they were prior to the fight. Now, obviously this is lobsters, not human beings. However, I feel like we can all connect with these ocean creatures in some ways that we respond to changes in our social worlds. Human social hierarchies normally follow a linear or near linear pattern. This means that there is one individual who is dominant over all the rest, a second who is subordinate to the first, but dominant to the rest, and so on. Now, when I first hear the term hierarchy, I think of the feudal system in medieval Europe, with the kings and nobles, knights, merchants, and then the unfortunate peasants at the bottom of the hierarchy. However, hierarchies do not always look like this, as they can and do form in all social groups. You may wonder now what defines a group. A group is essentially any number of individuals who are brought together with a common cause and who share common values. Let's take an example. Say you're walking along the road and you see someone collapse across the street from you on the sidewalk. Maybe they're an elderly person. Maybe they had a stroke. I would hope that you and anyone else who watched this happen would immediately rush over to the person and try to help them. In this situation, you are forming a group as you all share a common goal of helping this person. In this situation, there will normally be one individual who takes on a dominant role and starts to give out orders. Call 911 or get me a blanket. The other people in this group will then fall into a hierarchical structure around this person so that the job can be finished. Another example of this could be helping someone whose car has broken down on the side of the road. If there are many people all forming together in order to help the person, they also form a group. Now, these examples of groups are ones that are very short-term. They are normally dismantled very quickly after completing their goal. However, examples like relationships in the workplace or friend groups are that of long-term hierarchies. Now, dominant individuals reap the rewards of a successful group. Any resources produced by the group are passed up the hierarchical chain to the dominants, who are then responsible for distributing them, normally leaving the most to themselves. Because of this, as a dominant, it is in your best interest to maintain a strong hierarchical structure. This means that you need to control the subordinates at the bottom. Dominants normally do this through enforcing ways of conduct and punishments. You could, if you were a dominant, you might do this by excluding your coworker who challenged you on an idea last week, or making fun of a friend who didn't back you up. Because at the bottom of the hierarchy chain, you have access to fewer resources, it means that subordinates are more susceptible to illness, disease, and even depression. Now, in a strong hierarchy, everyone is aware and relatively content with their social standing. This means that fewer individuals are challenging each other, and therefore the harmony of the entire group is improved. This also reduces stress levels of all individuals. However, as a group gets bigger, it also becomes more productive. In this case, if the subordinates are still being suppressed, they are much more likely to rise up and challenge their dominance. The first example of this that comes to my mind is the French Revolution, where the poor French citizens rebelled against the rich nobility who was not distributing resources in an equal and fair fashion. Now, when this happens, dominants have two options. The first of which is to further suppress the subordinates, normally through physical aggression. And the second, and much more common route, because it works better, is to just share the resources in a fair enough way that the subordinates are happy with their standing. Now, there are certain characteristics that would aid or hinder an individual from establishing a high status position in society. Obviously, different cultures value different things, meaning that these characteristics do vary across cultures. However, there are some parallels, like honesty is normally seen as a good characteristic in aiding you in establishing a high status position across all cultures. In our society, we value things like intelligence, wealth, education, career, genetics, hormones, personality, social labels, attractiveness, morality, past social performance, and any sentimental attachment from other group members. This means that possessing these characteristics normally aid an individual in establishing a high status position. Now, due to the nature of these factors, we can conclude that these things can either be inherited from our parents through our DNA, learned as a child, or even learned later on as an adult. Now, the most important part of this study for me was the neurochemical bases to how we are able to recognize, form, and maintain social hierarchies. I identified many regions of the brain and neurochemicals that play a role in these complex processes. Now, before I begin, note that there are many brain regions involved. I've only chosen to speak about the main three: the amygdala, hippocampus, and ventral striatum. The amygdala is responsible for controlling emotional responses, so it recognizes things like trustworthiness, social rewards, and facial expressions. Because of this, it is the amygdala that allows us to connect with others and therefore form and maintain social hierarchies. The amygdala is also stimulated by motivation, meaning that if you were just praised or if you are motivated to overcome one of your peers who is of higher ranking, your amygdala will be stimulated. Because of all the complex processes that the amygdala supports, harm to the area results in an individual who is unable to appropriately judge social situations. This could result in a loss of dominance, dominant behaviors, and even trouble maintaining a career. Now, interestingly enough, the size of your amygdala directly correlates with the size and complexity of the social group you are a part of. Let's take an example. Say that you don't interact with many people on a regular basis. Maybe you own your own online business. Your amygdala volume will be smaller than that of a CEO, who is constantly having to juggle coworkers, employees, clients, friends, and family. Because of this, it could be suggested that a larger amygdala volume could indicate social dominance, because therefore you are better able to recognize and take in social information. However, this has not been proven. The next brain region is the hippocampus. The hippocampus works in close association with the amygdala to promote social memory. It is the hippocampus that gives our memories emotional and social context. And because us humans are very social, it therefore allows us to remember them better. Let's take another example. Now, this doesn't happen very often in Whistler because we don't have much traffic and we really only have one main road. However, imagine that you live in a big city and you have a 30-minute commute to work every day. Normally, you would follow a very similar, if not exactly the same route every single day. However, if you get in the car one morning and you hear on the radio that one of the main roads you normally take has had a car accident or there's a lot of traffic on it, you are able to use your critical thinking skills and your knowledge of the area to devise an alternate route to work that gets you there in about the same amount of time. This is your hippocampus working. In addition to this, the hippocampus is also responsible for recognizing social dimensions like power, tracking social behaviors, adjusting both your and others' hierarchical status, and using previous social knowledge in new contexts. The final brain region I'm going to talk about is the ventral striatum. The striatum is used in competitive contexts. So at sports games, both the athletes and anyone in the stands has highly activated ventral striatums. The striatum is very sensitive to social rewards, meaning that your striatum is working double time when you're going against someone of higher ranking. A study done by Martina Lai and others in 2011 concluded that dominant individuals responded better to dominant information, while individuals of lower status responded better to information coming from other low-status members. There are also a couple hormones that help us to navigate the social world. Cortisol is very similar to octopamine that I mentioned in lobsters. It results in stress. Now, a scientist named Denise Cummins studied cortisol and reported her findings in her paper, Dominance, Status, and Social Hierarchies. She concluded that people who ranked lower on the social hierarchy chain had higher levels of cortisol. This means that these people tended to live their life on the edge, and they assumed that any change is a threat and could be harmful to them. This prevents them from putting resources or thought aside to elevate their lifestyle, and therefore they struggle to build a future. An example of this could be drug addicts who are constantly just looking to get through the next day and get to their next hit. So they are unable to put aside resources and time into elevating their status. Serotonin, on the other hand, is more common in higher-ranking individuals. Serotonin results in a generally less stressful life, and therefore these people are better able to plan for the long term and elevate their lifestyle. Now, interestingly enough, the connection between these hormones and any external changes is bidirectional. This means that any perceived external change, like embarrassment or insecurity, can actually affect the concentration of these hormones in your brain, and vice versa. Now, the results of social experiences can live on with a person and affect their well-being, morbidity, and survival later in life. If you, as a child or teenager, consistently ranked lower on the hierarchical chain, it means that as an adult, normally your confidence levels will be lower as well. This means that you tend to live a more stressful life, and sometimes you can even have trouble completing certain tasks. In the long term, this results in emotions like rage, envy, shame, and even depression. On the other hand, individuals who did really well in the social world as a child or adolescent tend to continue to maintain this high status position later in life. They have lower baseline cortisols, which results in less frequent and less serious times of stress. A study done by P.K. Smith and 3 others in the early 2000s took 2 groups of people. The first they made to feel superior, and the second inferior. They then had these groups conduct cognitive tasks. They discovered that people who felt superior were better able to complete these tasks than those who felt inferior. This means that we could suggest that high-ranking people are better able to complete certain tasks throughout their life. To conclude, social hierarchies are an essential part of our societies. They define not just our groups, but us as individuals. Because of their organizational and social nature, social hierarchies have been a strong defining factor of both our species and our animal relatives. Social hierarchies can and do form in all social groups due to our brain's ability to interpret social information. There are various brain regions responsible for this complex process, and the results of it can live on in a person for even the rest of their lives. Now, in this new world of social media and technology, I think it is important to recognize that while our world is changing, there are still some fundamental human bases that define our societies, and these will not soon be forgotten. I urge you to take this information and use it to better understand the social world that we live in. Next time one of your friends or coworkers does or says something that doesn't make sense to you, reflect back on this. Is there a hidden reason why they might have acted in that way? How does your role in their social life reflect on their actions and ideas? Thank you. I will now introduce my artistic. It is this ladder right here. So I used wood, pasted photos, yarn, and some cloth to build my artistic. I decided to go with a collage format because number 1, I'm not very good at drawing, and number 2, I thought that a collage would better depict the message I was trying to get across. My artistic is meant to represent the levels of society. There is a gradual change in color from the bottom of the ladder to the top, representing how a different position in society affects individuals and their lifestyle. This cloth that wraps around it represents the unity and how important it is to have every single member of a society. There's also a little yellow piece of yarn strung through the cloth that represents the neural activity going on in our brains that allows us to recognize these social structures. And I now open the floor to questions. Yes. Mhm.
That they're more a learned activity versus the heredity part of it, or in the, so that the act of being in a hierarchy, you can unlearn your position and learn a new position? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think definitely both the actually like DNA of you and also what you learn, especially as a child, I think they both play a role. But I personally would say that it's more of what you learn, because I think your DNA, there's a lot that you can do with how you are made up. And so it's really, I think it's more so about what you learn as a child and your experiences as a child, because that is what teaches you how to navigate the social realm.
I heard that you asked the Whistler Waldorf students What did you learn from that research?
Well, I was more just interested in figuring out if each class, especially, had a unanimous decision on who they deemed as their dominant member, because normally in a social group there will only be one dominant member. So from the study, I learned, I think there was 2 classes where it was unanimous. They all voted for the same person. And the remaining classes, there was definitely a majority. However, it wasn't unanimous every time. And I do think it's interesting, especially one of the classes, there were quite a few different groups in it. So therefore, each group, you would kind of say the dominant in your group, which isn't necessarily the entire grade 10 class. And then out of the entire school, because I did that as well, the results were kind of all over the place, which makes sense because especially like the grades don't know each other that well. Like I don't know the grade 8s very well. So therefore I'm unable to kind of judge their social situation. And I think it's also kind of difficult because I don't see the whole high school as being one social group. So therefore there would actually be various members.
Thank you, Kai. There are some questions rolling in from our viewers right now. One is, many cultures and religions promote the concept of servant leadership. Why has that servant leadership become praiseworthy when social hierarchies seem to promote the opposite?
Can you better define the...
I guess why has I can't remember how you phrased it, sort of the peasant
the
king
feudal
relationship, the feudal system. So why has that become praiseworthy when social hierarchies seem to promote the opposite?
I think I got the grasp of that question, so I'm going to try to answer it the best I can. I would say that the reason why us as humans naturally go to social hierarchies is because we oftentimes look for leaders, and there are definitely individuals who are natural born leaders and those who can learn to become leaders. But I think as humans, we are always looking for someone to lead us and someone to tell us what to do in general. So I think that is why we have formed this hierarchical structure. However, there definitely are, as I mentioned, there are definitely problems with this structure, and it tends to be that people on the bottom really get the brute end of it. And so I think that's definitely something that we should be addressing in the future.
Another question is, how do you think that this applies to the current racial inequalities that we're seeing in the news and society today?
That is an excellent question. Just let me think on it for a second. I think that is another situation, like the first question. I think that the racial inequality is definitely something that has to be addressed, because that is not, and I don't think that is the fundamental basis of a social hierarchy. I think that's how us humans have turned it into, but that shouldn't be how things work. And I think in some cultures it definitely is, but there are also other cultures that I feel like the racism is not nearly as much of a problem. And so I think it definitely needs to be something that should be addressed, because there really is no logical basis as to why that would be a thing.
And another person's asking, do you think there's a possibility of evolving beyond social hierarchies?
I think in some way, yes. Like I said before, I think as humans, we need some form of leadership. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a social hierarchy. It could be a different, more inclusive form of group. But I do think, I do think we could move away from social hierarchies. However, I think our structure and us being humans will always kind of look towards some form of leadership. However, this doesn't have to be a suppressive form.
All right. Thank you so much, Kai.
Thank you. I will now be introducing Andrew Salter, who will be talking about the effects of breathwork.
Thank you. I would like to first start off with a little story. I'm 8 years old, it's recess time, and my favorite activity is to go straight to the monkey bars. I do this activity religiously. I go in the monkey bars, I swing from one bar to the other. However, on this particular day, I slipped and fell to the ground. I landed direct on my ankle, and it had me crying. I was on the ground crying as a teacher came over to me and asked what's wrong. Through my tears and cries, I was able to explain that I hurt my ankle. The only advice I was given was to just walk it off and take a deep breath. Flash forward a little bit longer, I'm 14 years old, and it's the night before a math test. Being myself, I cram all that knowledge into one night. It gets to 9 p.m., and I have to go to my last resort, and that's ask my parents for help. The only issue about asking your parents for help is that they always have a different method than the way that you learned. We're going back and forth. I'm getting more stressed out and anxious. We still can't come up to a conclusion. And they look at me and they say, Andrew, you just need to take a deep breath. I look at them, confused, as if breathing is going to solve this exam for me, which I was correct, but what they're getting at is that it would calm me down. In this presentation, I would show how being focused on and in control of your own breathing can positively affect your physical parameters, which include your respiratory rate, heart rate, blood pressure, etc., which can relate to your own personal emotions such as anxiety, stress, and fear. I think that's good. For my first main point here today, I'll be talking about Wim Hof. Now, Wim Hof is a Dutch athlete who competes in a variety of very extreme activities. What he does is that one of his many... Sorry, 1 second. Just fixing up the slideshow. Awesome. Sorry about that. 1 second. So I guess we're just going to work what the slideshow we have here. So like what I was saying, my first main point that I'll be talking about is Wim Hof. Now, Wim Hof is an extreme Dutch athlete who's completed adventurous tasks that seem dangerous to the ordinary person. Some of his tasks consist of hiking the death zone in Mount Everest and only wearing his shorts. He also spends hours in ice-cold water just for fun. And what he says is that through his method, anybody can do this. Wim Hof has designed what he calls the Wim Hof method. The Wim Hof method consists of 3 pillars of breath holding, breathing, and meditation. However, none of these are new ideas, as people have been practicing elements of the Wim Hof method for thousands of years. The Wim Hof method dabbles deeply with yoga, specifically Tomo or Chindi yoga, which all just uses breathing to generate heat. How this method works is that it consists of a repeated hyperventilation, which is just breathing heavily, and which is then followed by hypoventilation, which is just breath holding. This results in initial drop in carbon dioxide when you exhale out while hyperventilating, which is called hypocapnia. Then there's hypoxia, which is a low O2 level, which is a result of the breath hold. Hoff is one of the first individuals to take these breathing methods into the scientific environment in order to back up his claims that he is able to voluntarily influence his autonomic nervous system in order to combat diseases and bacteria. All right, we're back. So this experiment was called the endotoxin study, which took place at the Redbound University in 2014, and it was able to show that Hoff was, through his method, able to involuntarily influence his autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is in control of things such as your breathing, heart rate, and digestion, something that is thought to be under conscious control up until then. This experiment consisted of injecting Wim Hof with a dead bacteria known as E. coli. This dead bacteria normally triggers the immune response to produce inflammatory cells. This inflammation of cells then produces flu-like symptoms such as fever, headaches, and nausea. However, once the experiment was finished, Hoff said he felt none of these symptoms. Now, how could that be? The results of the experiment show that through Hoff's breathing method, he was able to cause his cortisol levels to go up, which were much higher than other test subjects. The inflammation of cells were shown to be suppressed by 30 to 50% compared to normal subjects. What's significant about this experiment is that it shows Hoff was, through his breathing method, able to influence the reactions of the immune system. However, in order to conclude this experiment and that this method does work, a much bigger one was needed. That is when another experiment did happen, not just in Hoff himself, but 30 average people. 30 healthy males volunteered to undergo this experiment. 18 of those 30 volunteers were trained by Hoff prior to the experiment, while the other 12 people went in the experiment with no breathing techniques. In order to record the data, the medical lab focused on the recording of blood levels such as cytokines and catecholamines, as well as white blood cell count. There was also focus on other aspects of the body, such as the heart rate and the heart rate and temperature. The first group, who were the non-trained subjects, were injected with the dead bacteria and experienced the usual symptoms and the typical reaction of the immune system. This group of people just simply endured the bacteria with no breathing techniques and experienced the usual symptoms of uncontrolled shivering, sickness, and the flu, which to me sounds pretty crazy that people would volunteer themselves just to get the flu. On the other side of the experiment, who were the trained subjects, those people did keep a cyclical pattern of controlled breathing, using the techniques taught to them the 4 days prior for the first 2.5 hours of the 8-hour experiment. To our astonishment, all 18 of those individuals were able to influence their immune response and have little to no symptoms. Nonetheless, how did these individuals complete this adventurous task, and how did this training change the results of this test? The 18 people went to Poland, where they trained in a mixture of cold exposure, meditation, and breathing techniques, all over a course of just 4 days, guided by Hoff. The volunteers participated in a variety of exercises, such as ice-cold swimming, standing and lying in the snow, and a final test of summiting a mountain with an elevation of 1,500 meters, with recorded wind chills of up to negative 27 degrees Celsius, only wearing shorts. To put that into perspective, that's like hiking up Whistler Mountain in just your underwear. Going back to the beginning of the experiment, the trained group had an increase in adrenaline levels from the breathing exercises. This breathing exercises and adrenaline played a key role for the rest of the experiment as it contributed to the production of interleukin 10. Interleukin 10 is an anti-inflammatory that helps limit immune responses to pathogens. Therefore, preventing damage to the human anatomy and maintaining normal homeostasis. As a result, that is why the trained subjects were able to release less of these inflammatory proteins, unlike the control group. And that is why the trained group had fewer symptoms and in the end were able to recover faster. Now, could this same breathing technique keep someone's body temperature stable even in the face of extreme cold exposure? I know personally, growing up in Whistler, there have been some times on the mountain where I thought my toes were going to fall off. However, normally to combat any cold exposure, the body restricts blood flow in order to keep vital organs stable. The body also releases hormones such as cortisol and norepinephrine. The main role of norepinephrine is to transfer blood flow towards areas of the body that are under stress, such as muscles. The primary function of cortisol is to maintain blood pressure and maintain fluid. Hoff once again said that through his method, he is able to control his body temperature by will, even in extreme cold environments, and decided to take his method into the scientific experiment. This experiment took place at Wayne State University and was called the brain over body experiment. It consisted of putting Wim Hof inside a cold suit. Now, this cold suit had the ability to be infused with cold or warm water in order to regulate the user's body temperature that could then be measured in a PET scan or fMRI. Wayne State University then conducted the same experiment using other average individuals. Over a period of 25 minutes, water was induced into the skin, and water was induced into the suit, and skin temperature was recorded. The water that is released into the water that is released into the suit goes from a neutral state of 34 degrees Celsius within the body, which is just normal body skin temperature, to a cold state, which is 15 degrees Celsius within the body, and then back to neutral. First, a control group underwent the experiment, and as predicted, their skin temperature dropped as exposed to the cold water. After a test point was established and a typical reaction to the cold was determined, Hoff was asked to undergo the same procedure, but this time using no breathing techniques. His results were similar to those of the controlled, as skin temperature dropped when exposed to the cold water. They then conducted the same experiment with Hoff, but this time they asked him to incorporate his own breathing methods. This time, the results showed a stable skin temperature of 34 degrees over the period of 25 minutes. This is significant because this is a 19-degree difference within the body compared to the control group. This is completely contrary to the results of the control group, who experienced decreased body temperatures. Once Wayne State University saw the results, they decided to conduct a PET scan and fMRI using Hoff in order to understand these findings. They wanted to see where this excess heat was coming from. From the PET scan, it showed that the intercostal muscles, which is in between the lungs and the ribs, was generating the increased body temperature. It showed that the body was absorbing glucose at a significant rate and transferring the heat throughout the body, and in result, stabilizing Hoff's body temperature. Even with the induced chilling effect of the cold suit, the skin temperature was able to stay around 34 degrees Celsius. Now, was this the only activity going within the body? Using the fMRI scan, Wayne State University was able to observe plenty of activity that was gone in the brain that could contribute to the sustainability of body and skin temperature. The first section of the brain that I observed was the insula, which is a small section of the cerebral cortex. The insula is responsible for someone's self-awareness of their body and emotion. Observing the control group, who were the non-breathing techniques, they saw that there was a low-level activity of the insula, which is a sign of hypothermia. Hoff did indeed have the similar results in the insula. However, his results initially peaked higher and then decreased compared to the control group. The section of the brain that showed the most difference when compared to the control group was the periaqueductal ductal gray area, known as the PAG area. The PAG area is responsible for the perception of pain and was seen to have a great deal of activity as shown by Hoff. As activity for the insula began to drop, activity in the PAG area began to rise in tandem. Endogenous opioids and endocannabinoids are released as a result of this activity. The endogenous opioid is known to activate an opioid receptor, which is in control of feelings towards reward and pain. Those are the same feelings you get after you finish a really good workout, and you feel very good about yourself after. However, no activity was found within the preductal area of the control group, just a linear, flat graph. This experiment demonstrates that the activity shown in the PAG area section of the brain, only shown by Hoff, has a high degree of control over sections of the autonomic nervous system and sections of the brains that regulate psychological reactions to the cold. This means that using his method, with practice, individuals are able to regulate their response to the cold environments. However, I still don't recommend skiing in your underwear in the winter, as you will probably still get really cold. As shown above, it is possible that breathing can affect someone's physical well-being. However, could the same be said about someone's emotional well-being? Everyone at least once in their life has been given the same advice of just take a deep breath. But what does that really mean? Is there any scientific evidence for that? In order to determine if breathing can help, we must first look into how the nervous system is related to breathing. The autonomic nervous system is broken up into two sections: the sympathetic nervous system, which is in control of the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is in control of the rest and relaxation response. These two nervous systems work independently from one another, meaning only one of them can be active at a time while the other is suppressed. How this relates to anxiety and stress is that by breathing deep, more oxygen is able to enter your blood, which eventually reaches deeper sections of the brain, in particular the amygdala. The amygdala section of the brain. The amygdala is the control section of the fight or flight response and sends signals to release stress hormones and prepare your body to fight or run away. Now, as you breathe deep, a signal is sent to your brain to calm down and relax, resulting in a decrease in high blood pressure, deeper breathing, and decreased heart rate. This result is a common response. Now, what are these techniques and how can we incorporate them into our day-to-day lives? The first technique I would like to talk about is just the 4-7-8 breath method by Dr. Andrew Way. This method is fairly simple. I'll first describe it to you guys, and then I'll walk the audience through it. You first inhale quietly through your nose for a count of 4, and then for the next 7 seconds, you hold your breath, and for the count of 8, you exhale. When you guys are ready, I'll get you guys to do this for me. Slowly inhale through your nose for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath for a count of 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And lastly, exhale through your mouth for a count of 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Dr. Way explains that this method should be used twice daily up to a month before experiencing any of the profound benefits. Dr. Way proclaims that the theory behind it is that by imposing certain rhythms on your breath with your voluntary system, the rhythms are gradually induced into your involuntary system, meaning they become a natural reaction. An article done by the Health Journal Science states that the 4-7-8 breathing method is able to help with reducing stress, getting to sleep, and controlling the fight or flight response, as well as reducing and controlling anger responses. Now, there really isn't a time in your life where someone's going to sit you down and tell you that you are breathing improperly. I mean, to put in perspective, we breathe 22,000 times a day. you've practically mastered how to breathe and you think that there's nothing else you could do. What if I told you that there is a right or wrong way from breathing? This method I would like to talk about is just simply breathing through the nose. James Nestor is an author of a book, and he wrote on just breathing named Breath, the Science of a Lost Art. And he believes that we as humans have lost the ability to breathe properly. Nestor speaks about how we as humans have been changing over the last hundreds of years, and these changes have had no benefits to our long-term health. Nestor goes on to say that to 400 to 500 years ago, everybody had perfect to close, straight, perfect teeth, meaning no braces were needed, no Invisalign, and no trips to the orthodontist. This means that because over time our mouths are growing smaller. This is due to our change in diet. Having a problem with a small mouth is that now we have a small airway, resulting in it being more difficult to breathe through. This is a reason why plenty of us suffer from conditions such as sleep apnea, snoring, respiratory problems, forms of asthma, all due to having a mouth that is too small for our faces. Nestor states that we should be primarily breathing through our nose. However, to understand why breathing through the nose is more beneficial, we must first look at how the nose works. As you inhale through your nostrils, air enters the nasal passageway and then into the nasal cavity, reaching the trachea and then to the lungs. The nose is not limited to just a passageway for air, it also warms, moistens, and filters the air that we breathe. However, when you breathe through your mouth, you get none of these benefits. Another large benefit of nasal breathing is that through each breath, you can get up to 20% more oxygen that enters the bloodstream than breathing through the mouth would. That is because exhaling through the nose keeps the air in the lungs just a little bit longer. In our natural state, humans are all nose breathers. However, mouth breathing is in response due to emergency stress, which can cause hyperventilation and cause more anxiety, which can then affect our health. In conclusion, it is evident that breathing exercises can change your heart rate, blood pressure, skin temperature, and dampen the immune response, as well as your respiratory rates, which were previously thought not to be under conscious control. These breathing techniques have been shown to decrease the fight or flight response, in which turn can decrease fear, anxiety, and stress. The biggest takeaway I would like the audience to have is to just be more conscious of your breathing and focus more on the breath. Thank you very much. For my art piece, I chose to do a painting of the brain and the lungs. I chose to do a tree in the center that is connected the lungs to the brain. As trees deliver oxygen, I thought that was a nice piece to it. In one side of my lungs, I have a more of a nature theme to it, as that I find is more of the healthy benefits to it, whereas the other side of the lung is more of a modern industrial side, whereas as poison in the tree and all those nutrients go up into the brain, it's which ones you pick on which you want. A couple challenges I found with this was painting. I myself aren't a painter. It was one of my first time painting, but I'm really happy with the final product I had with that. I will now open the floor to any questions.
You showed Wim Hof's experiments, and you showed a few of them, and they're amazing experiments that show in detail his abilities, which are outstandingly amazing. So my question to you is, why do you believe that there is still within the scientific community a skepticism or a hesitation towards Wim Hof as a character and as a man of science, even though he's able to produce such outstanding results?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in this day and age, having the theme of self-help is kind of a controversial thing, as there's not much evidence behind that. But what's Wim Hof doing is that he's actually taken his method into the scientific laboratory and having evidence that this breathing method does work in changing your respiratory rate, which can combat like I was showing, bacteria and diseases, which can then benefit your long-term health. So in that sense, if I answer that question properly.
Awesome, thank you. A second question, I believe, coming from your father.
Great.
Have you yourself practiced any breath control exercises? And if you have you noticed any effects?
Really good question, yeah. I personally went actually into a breathwork session with a local in Whistler who does a workshop in breathing, and I found that to be very beneficial with my sleeping pattern, as I mainly went into this Great 12 project as trying to learn a new skill. I wanted something that could benefit me personally that I can incorporate to my day-to-day lives. My biggest problem was just getting to sleep. During the pandemic, there was a lot of extra stress going on in our lives, and so that's where I started learning more about these kind of methods and getting to sleep, and that's where I came across breathwork, and I was able to, like I said, do a session, and from that I found to have a big benefit on my sleeping pattern and just overall mental health for sure.
Question coming from Miss Ellen McLean. Do you see there being any concerns with implementing the Wim Hof method for the average person? Any dangers?
Any dangers? No, to my knowledge, there's no negative side effects to the Wim Hof method.
One further question coming from Georgia Lee. Based on your research, how do you think that this year of mask wearing has affected us? Are there ways to breathe effectively while still wearing a mask?
That's a good question. Like, just through that, like, mask kind of definitely does make it more difficult to breathe through. And through that, I have actually not researched any proper methods to breathe through a mask. So, unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer from that. Just all I gotta say there.
One of the parts of Wim Hof's method is also for the average person getting into cold showers every day. Have you yourself practiced any type of cold exposure recently?
I'm yet to practice the cold showers.
Future?
Yes. After a hot tub, for sure. No, awesome. Thank you, guys. We are now going to take a short 15-minute break, and after we'll have Georgia speaking about the inequalities of gender within the workplace.